Hello, bright learners! Okay, we have got to finish the Boxcar Children. So today, in this one video, we are going to read the last 3 chapters of our book. Are you ready? Okay, let's do it. First, let's get rid of our banner. Do you want to help? On the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. Good. Okay. This chapter is called A New Grandfather. In less than an hour, the town was buzzing with the news. The chauffeur told the maids, and the maids told the grocery man, and the grocery man went from house to house telling that old James Cordyce had found his 4 grandchildren at last. In fact, the biggest part of the town knew before even the children themselves. Jessie and Benny came across the lawn to select some white moonflowers for Violet's tray. They were just in time to hear Henry say, "But grandfather—" "Grandfather?" echoed Jessie, whirling around to gaze at them. "Yes, Jessie," said Henry eagerly. "He's the man we've been running away from this whole time." "I thought you was old," observed Benny, "and awfully cross. Jessie said so." "I didn't know, Benny," said Jessie, turning pink. "To think of running away from a kind friend." But her grandfather did not seem to mind. He stroked her short, silky hair and proposed that they all go up into Violet's room with the moonflowers. There was no stopping Benny. He rushed into Violet's room, dragging his grandfather by one hand and shouting, "It's Grandfather, Violet, and he's nice after all. I shouldn't wonder." When Violet at last understood just what Benny was trying to tell, she was perfectly happy to rest against her ruffled pillows, with one hand curled about her grandfather's arm, and listen to the rest. "Where have you been living?" demanded Mr. Cordyce at last. The whole company looked at each other, even Dr. McAllister and his mother. Then they all laughed as if they would never stop. "You just ought to see," observed Dr. McAllister, wiping his eyes. "What?" said the children all at once. "You never saw it in the daytime." "You don't mean it," returned the doctor, teasing them. "I have seen it quite a number of times in the daytime." "Seen what, in heaven's name?" asked Mr. Cordyce at last. Then they told him, interrupting each other to tell about the beds of pine needles, the wonderful dishes, the freight car roof over it all, the fireplace, and the swimming pool. "That's where Violet got her bronchitis," observed the doctor, "sitting by that pool. She shouldn't have done it. I thought so from the first." "You thought so?" repeated Henry, puzzled. "How did you know she sat by it? I'm sure I didn't know myself." "I was your most frequent visitor," declared the doctor, enjoying himself hugely. "I hope you were our only one," said Jessie with her mouth open. "Well, I think I was," said the doctor. "The first night after Henry mowed my lawn, I followed him as far as the hill to see where he lived." "Why did you do that?" interrupted Mr. Cordyce. "I liked his looks," returned the doctor, "and I noticed that he didn't tell me much about himself, so I was curious." "But you surely didn't see the freight car then," said Jessie. "No, but I came back that night and hunted around," replied Dr. McAllister. "At about 11 o'clock, Henry cried. The doctor assented. "Our rabbit," said Henry and Jessie together. "I made as little noise as possible when I saw the freight car. Then I saw the door move, so I thought someone was inside, and when I heard the dog bark, I was sure of it and went home." "But you came back?" questioned Jessie. "Yes, every time I knew all of you were safe in my garden, I made you a little visit just to be sure you were having enough to eat and enough dishes." The doctor laughed. "When I found you had a strainer and a vase of flowers and a salt shaker and a cut glass punch bowl, I stopped worrying." "Didn't you suspect they were my children?" demanded Mr. Cordyce. "Didn't you see my advertisement? Why didn't you notify me at once?" "They were having such a good time," confessed the doctor, "and I was too. I just wanted to see how long they could manage their own affairs. It was all tremendously interesting. Why, that boy and girl of yours are born business managers, Mr. Cordyce." Mr. Cordyce took note of this. "But I don't see yet how you knew Violet sat by the pool," said Jessie curiously. "You wouldn't know that, of course," replied the doctor. "I went up twice when I knew Henry had taken the dog down to my barn to catch rats. I hid behind the big white rock with the flat top." "That's Lookout Rock," explained Jessie, "where we used to let Benny watch for Henry, but we didn't hear you." "No," said Dr. McAllister, "I didn't even snap a twig those times. But I had the very best time when I went with Mother." "Have you seen it too?" cried all the children. "I have indeed," returned Mrs. McAllister. I even had a drink from your well." "Everyone has seen it but me," said Mr. Cordyce patiently. "We'll show it to you," screamed Benny, "and I'll show you my wheels made on a cart and my bed out of hay and my pink cup." "Good for you, Benny," said Mr. Cordyce, pleased. "When Violet gets well, we'll all go up there, and if you show me your house, I'll show you mine." "Have you got a house?" asked Benny in surprise. "Yes, you can live there with me if you like," replied Mr. Cordyce. "I have been looking for you for nearly 2 months." Under Mrs. McAllister's wonderful care, Violet soon became strong again. But she had been skipping around the garden for several days before the doctor would allow the visit to the freight car house. When at last the whole party started out in the great limousine, many people looked out of their windows to watch after Mr. Cordyce and his grandchildren. Many of them knew Henry as the boy who won the race and were glad that he had found such a friend. Let's look at their boxcar again so we can remember what it looked like. But when the children reached their beloved home, they were like wild things. Watch capered around furiously, taking little swims in the pool and sniffing at all the dear old familiar things. Mr. Cordyce seated himself on a rock. Where did I stop? And watched them all, exchanging a glance now and then with Mrs. McAllister and her son. "See our building?" shouted Benny, for that was what he always called the fireplace. "It burns really, too. And this is the well, and this is the dishpan, and this is the refrigerator." And at last everyone climbed into the car itself, and Mr. Cordyce saw all the books, the beds, the cash account on the wall, the wonderful shelf, and each separate dish. Each dish had a story of its own. "That's more than my dishes have," observed Mr. Cordyce. Mrs. McAllister, who knew what his dishes were silent. "Because his dishes were really fancy, I bet, because he's got a lot of money." They ate chicken sandwiches on the very same tablecloth, and Benny drank from his pink cup, and Watch couldn't understand why they went away at all. But it was a trifle cool on the hill now when the sun began to sink, and after rolling the door shut, they left regretfully. "Tomorrow," suggested Mr. Cordyce as they drove home, "will you come and see my house?" "Oh, yes," agreed the children happily, little dreaming what was in store for them on the next day and all of the days to come. All right, the next chapter is called A United Family. Mr. Cordyce had been planning this day for more than a week. He had sent his most trusted foreman to his own beautiful home to superintend matters there. The house was being remodeled entirely after Mr. Cordyce's own plan, and everywhere were carpenters and painters and decorators. Hey, maybe we need to decorate our place just to get in the spirit of things. Let's see. What should we do exactly? Well, I know what we'll do. Since the children are each going to have their own rooms, let's think about how their rooms are going to be decorated. Let's go ahead and draw little pictures of them. Okay. These rooms aren't the same size. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. On the very day that Mr. Cordyce received word that it was finished, he suggested the drive. "Do you live all alone, Grandfather?" asked Benny. "All alone," said Mr. Cordyce. "No company at all." At first, Benny did not consider this the exact truth. He considered a cook company, and also a butler and a housekeeper. And when he saw the array of maids, he kept perfectly quiet. The house was enormous, certainly. It was at least 1/4 of a mile from its own front gate, and everywhere were gardens. "Do you live here?" asked Henry, thunderstruck, as they rolled quietly along the beautiful drive. "You do too, if you like it," observed his grandfather, watching his face. The inside of the house was more wonderful than ever the children had ever dreamed. The velvet rugs were so thick and soft that no footfall could be heard. Everywhere were flowers. The great staircase with steps of marble rose from the center of the big hall, but it was upstairs that the children felt most at home. Here the rooms were not quite so large. They were sunny and homelike. "This is Violet's room!" cried Benny. It was unmistakable. There were violets on the wallpaper. The bed was snow white with a thick quilt of violet silk. On the little table were English violets poured their fragrance into the room. That sounds beautiful. I love Violet's room. All right, let's see. English violets are actually a very dark purple that I like. Let's see. Maybe we can do a little bit of wallpaper. Maybe that's a good idea. Let's do this. Paint Violet's room white and put violets on the wallpaper. You know, I don't really know what a violet looks like. I think it has a couple little sweet flowers like this. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Maybe you know better than I do. Maybe you can look it up somewhere. But I think it's like this. Violet. And Violet's name starts with what letter? You know that's easy. V. Violet. All right, that's good. Let's see who's next. "What a beautiful room," sighed Violet, sinking down into one of the soft cushioned chairs. But the children shouted when they saw Benny's room. The wallpaper was blue, covered with large figures of cats and dogs and the 3 bears and Peter Rabbit. What? There was a swinging rocking horse, nearly as large as a real horse, a blackboard, a tool chest, and low tables and chairs exactly the right size for Benny. There was an electric train with cars, as nearly as large as the boy himself. Oh, goodness, we have so much to draw for Benny's room. Okay, Benny's room will be white. They said his wallpaper was blue, so we should do blue. With cats and dogs. I'm not very good at drawing cats and dogs. Let's see. We'll do a cat. Eyes and whiskers. And a smile. And a dog. Maybe he wants to have a dog like Watch. There's that. And he also has tables and chairs and a toolbox and Peter Rabbit and a train. Oh, I think that's enough for him, though. A cat and a dog. And that's Benny's room. All right, let's keep going. "Can I run the cars all day?" asked Benny. "Oh, no," replied Henry quickly. "You're going to school as soon as it begins." This was the first that his grandfather had heard about school, but he agreed with Henry and chuckled to himself. "The finest schools in the country," he said. This came true, for all the children went to the public schools, and are they not the finest schools in the country? In Jessie's room, Benny discovered a bed for Watch. It was, in fact, a regular dog's straw hamper, but it was lined with heavy quilted silk and padded with wool. Watch got in it at once, sniffed in every corner, turned around 3 times, and lay down. All right, so Jessie's room. We don't really know what Jessie's room looks like, except that it has a bed for Watch. So maybe we'd have to imagine. I think Jessie would probably like a shelf with some books on it. She seems like a kind of person who's a reader. Put some books up here on the shelf. Nice. And then Watch can have a big bed. Let's give him a green padded quilt. Okay, there's Jessie's room. Jessie. And guess what? We don't know what Henry's room looked like. I don't think. Nope. So we never see Henry's room. So here's your assignment. What do you think Henry's room might have looked like? That's my question. I'm curious. What do you think his grandfather would think that Henry would like in his room? Oh, that's a better question, isn't it? Okay. You think about it and I'll erase this. Just then a distant doorbell rang. It was such a low, musical chime that the children listened delightedly, never once giving a thought as to who it might be. But almost at once a soft-footed servant appeared, saying that a man wanted to see Mr. Cordyce about the dog. The moment Jessie heard that the word dog, she was frightened. She had never thought Watch a common runaway dog, and it always made her uncomfortable to see passers-by gazing curiously at him as he ran by her side. "They won't take Watch away," she whispered to Henry, her breath almost gone. "Indeed they will not," declared Henry. "We will never, never give him up." However, Henry followed his grandfather and Jessie with great anxiety. It was indeed about Watch that the man wanted to talk, and Jessie's heart sank when she saw that the dog jumped delightedly upon the man and returned his caresses with short barks. "He's a runaway, sir, from my kennels out in Townsend," the man explained to Mr. Cordyce. "I have 200 Airedales out there, and this one was sold the day before he ran away, so you see I have to turn him over to the lady I sold him to." "Oh, no, you don't," returned Mr. Cordyce quickly. "I'll give you 3 times what the dog is worth." The man glanced around uneasily. "I couldn't do that, sir," he explained. "You see, it isn't a question of money. It's a question of my promised word to the lady." Mr. Cordyce failed to see. "She can find another dog among 200 Airedales, I guess," he returned. "And besides, you don't know positively that this is the right dog." "Excuse me," replied the man, very much embarrassed, "but he's the dog, all right. He knows me, as you see. His name is Rough Number 3. He has a black spot inside his ear." It was too true. Indeed, at the mere mention of his name, the dog cocked an ear and wagged his tail, but he had seated himself as close to Jessie as possible and licked her hand when she patted him. But it appeared that Henry could understand the man's position, even if Mr. Cordyce could not, because Henry is very ethical. He now put it in a timid word of his own. "If the lady would agree to let the dog go, would you be willing?" "Sure," said the man, shooting a glance at Henry. "I almost know any one of us would keep Watch, grandfather," said Henry earnestly, "if they knew how much he had done for us." "I'm sure of it, my boy," returned Mr. Cordyce kindly. The fact that Henry had been the first to make headway with the dog fancier had not escaped him. But it was clear that Jessie would not be able to sleep until the matter had been settled, so the moment the man had gone, the children set out from their beautiful new home to the address of the lady who had bought Watch. The big car purred along from Greenfield to Townsend in no time, and the whole family, including Watch himself, trooped up the veranda steps to interview the lady who held in her power to break their hearts or to make them very happy. She was not terrible to look at. In fact, she was quite young, quite lively, and very, very pretty. She asked them all to sit down, which they did gravely, for even Benny was worried about losing Watchy, his favorite pillow. He could not wait for his grandfather to begin. He struggled down from his chair and dashed over to the young lady, saying in one breath, "You'll let us keep Watchy, please, won't you? Because we want him so bad, and Jessie didn't know he was your dog." By degrees, the lady understood what dog it was. "We've had him so long," explained Henry eagerly. "It would be almost like letting Benny go away. Watch never leaves us even for a minute, ever since Jessie took the briar out of his foot." "So you are the children who lived in the freight car," observed the lively young lady. "I've heard all about that. How did you like it?" "All right," replied Henry with an effort, "but we never could have done it without Watch. He stayed and looked after the girls while I was away, and he just thinks everything of Jessie." "Well," said the young lady, laughing, "I can see you're worrying terribly about that dog. Now listen, I wouldn't take that dog away from you any more than I'd take Benny. In fact, not so much. I think maybe I'd like to keep Benny for myself." Benny was apparently quite willing that she should. He climbed into her lap before anyone could stop and gave her one of the biggest bear hugs. And from that moment they were very firm friends. But the children always spoke of her as the lady who owns Watch, although Mr. Cordyce paid for the dog in less time than you can imagine. It made no difference to the children that Watch was a very valuable dog. They had loved him when he had not been worth a cent, and now they loved him even more, simply because they had so nearly lost him. It was a happy and reunited family which gathered around the Cordyce dining room table that evening. The maids smiled in the kitchen to hear the children laugh, and the children laughed because Watch actually sat up at the table in the seat of honor beside Jessie and was waited upon by a butler. That means they brought Watch his dinner on a plate at the table. All right, this is the last chapter. Yes. This chapter is called Safe. Would you ever dream that 4 children could be homesick in such a beautiful house as Mr. Cordyce's? Jessie was the first one to long for the old freight car. "Oh, grandfather," she said one morning, "I wish I could cook something once more in the old kettle." "Go out in the kitchen," said her grandfather, "and mess around all you like. The maids will help you." Jessie brightened up at once and flew out into the kitchen where 3 or 4 maids brought her everything she wanted to cook with. And Benny was the last one to wish for his old comb. "Grandfather," he said one day, "I wish I could drink this milk out of my own pink cup." This set Mr. Cordyce to thinking. He had plenty of pink cups, it's true, but none of them were as dear to Benny as his own. "I think I shall have to surprise you, children," said Mr. Cordyce at last. "But before the surprise comes, perhaps you would like to see Benny's pony." Then he led the way to the stables. He owned several beautiful horses already and nearly a dozen wonderful cars, but nothing was half so interesting as the pony. He was very small and very fat and black. His wavy tail was so long that it nearly touched the ground, and his name was Cracker because his birthday fell on the 4th of July when firecrackers were popping. All the others sat down on the fragrant hay to watch him ride. "What am I going to do when I grow up, grandfather?" asked Henry. "You're going to take my place, Henry, as president of the steel mills," replied Mr. Cordyce. "You'll do it better than I ever have." And one day this came true, just as most of Mr. Cordyce's prophecies did. "And what am I going to do?" asked Jessie curiously. "All you children must go to school and then to college." "Then you may do whatever you choose for a living," replied Mr. Cordyce. This also came true. "Of course, I have more than enough money to support us all," went on Mr. Cordyce, "but if you have something to do, you'll be happier." This not only came true, but is always and forever true all over the world. Yes. "Am I going to college tomorrow?" asked Benny, stopping his little pony in front of the group. "Not tomorrow, Benny," said his grandfather, laughing, "but I'm glad you reminded me. All you children must go over to Dr. McAllister's tomorrow and stay while the surprise comes." "Is the surprise very nice?" asked Benny. "No, not very," replied Mr. Cordyce with a twinkle in his eyes. "Did it cost a great deal?" asked Jessie. "It didn't cost me anything," answered her grandfather. "The only thing I shall have to pay will be the express." However, next day the children rode gladly over to see the kind doctor. They stayed until Mr. Cordyce telephoned to them that the surprise was ready, and then Mrs. McAllister and her son rode back with them in the big car. Mr. Cordyce was as happy as a boy. He led the merry little procession out through his many gardens, past the rose garden, through the banks of purple asters. Then they came to an Italian garden with a fountain in the middle and a shady little wood around the edge. Among the trees was the surprise. It was the old freight car. The children rushed over it with cries of delight, pushed back the dear old door, and scrambled in. Everything was in place. Here was Benny's pink cup, and here was his bed. Here was the old knife which had cut butter and bread and vegetables and firewood and string, and here were the letters for Benny's primer. Here was the big kettle and the tablecloth, and hanging on a nearby tree was the old dinner bell. Benny rang the bell over and over again. Watch rolled on the floor and barked himself hoarse. Whoa, 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 whoa. The children were never homesick after that. To be sure, a dull and ugly freight car looked a little strange in a beautiful Italian garden, but it was never dull or ugly to the Cordyce children or their dog. They never were so happy as when showing visitors each beauty of their beloved old home. And there were many visitors. Some of them were fascinated by the stories of the wonderful dishes on the shelf, and the children never grew tired of telling them over and over. One summer day, many years afterward, Watch climbed out of his beautiful padded silk bed and barked until Henry lifted him up into the freight car. There he lay down on the hard, splintery floor, blinking his eyes in the sun and watching the children as they sat studying by the fountain. "He likes the old home best," said Jessie Cordyce, smiling at him and patting his rough back. And as Benny would say if he hadn't grown up, "That's true, I shouldn't wonder." The end. Bye, bright learners. We'll start a new book soon. See you later.